Hey there. Today I'm excited to have this conversation with Kate from Mystic in the Woods regarding the Divine Feminine. And we have like a little bit of a focus of like topic ideas, but I'm just excited to talk anything regarding the Divine Feminine with someone who knows more than I do. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, I mean it's a big topic, and I think it's one of those where you don't realize it's such a big topic until you start to get into the world,
Yeah.
into the sacred feminine world, and then you kind of go, "Oh, wow."
So many layers and so many moving parts. And yeah, so I had explained to you, I think in an email, and maybe the people listening know this story, and even if they don't, like I'll tell it again. So my business storefront is called Moon Magic. I've been doing my work since I was 16, but like officially since I was 24, 22. And for the last 10 years, I've been rebalanced with Reiki and massage. And when I got my new space in 2020, which was a whole story, and there's a podcast episode about it, but like it needed to be called Moon Magic. Like I knew it had to be called Moon Magic, and I didn't know, I just couldn't call it the Rebalance Spiritual Wellness Center.
Yeah.
And then I was like designing the logo and like the brochure, and all of the imagery was like just coming to mind. And it wasn't until after it was all done that I realized everything was like divine feminine. And I was like, what is being born through me? So I didn't
hmm
even know. I didn't even know the moon was feminine. I didn't. So it's like, and then somewhere during 2020, maybe early 2021, I had a reading with somebody, and she's like, you should look into the Sophia, like divine feminine, like Sophia.
hmm
She just mentioned it, like Sophia, the goddess Sophia. And that opened up the door to like diving into the divine.
Yeah.
And I never really found it. And I couldn't even tell you now with Sophia. It just opened the fire hose of information. And
Yeah.
then within a year, I tried to like organize it all to teach others, and I was like, I can't do this. It's too much information. I have to just back off on that project. But I had like a million headings and like chapters or like subtitles for like this and then that, and then oh my god, and the church and the Gnostics, and
I know.
it gets to be so overwhelming.
Yeah.
No, I was so grateful to
Mhm.
find your account where I'm like, oh, somebody else can explain it to more clearly than me. So yeah, what got you started on the divine feminine like path?
So if I go all the way back to college, because I was raised Christian and then sort of Catholic, and then my mom left the Catholic Church. But it was I call it like Christian light because it wasn't like the really dark, culty type of Christianity that I help a lot of clients work through. But enough of it sunk in that I hadn't realized until I was older. But in in college, I went to school for biology and psychology. And I had to take an intro to religious studies. It was like one of the options for those, electives. And I took it and I was just instantly hooked on this idea of looking at religion through the scholarship lens. And then I took my second class, and that one was women in religion. And my professor talked about Mary Magdalene and how she was not, in fact, the prostitute that everybody talks about her as. That's just literally not in any of the scripture. It's just something that Pope Gregory kind of just decided.
Mhm.
And I just remember it opening this door to something in my mind. Something in my body just went, wait, back up. If they lied to me about Mary Magdalene, what else wasn't I told? And it started to fill in this missing gap that Christianity had always had for me. Because like I said, I didn't grow up in one of those really overtly harmful Christian households. I mostly had a good experience with it, but it felt like it was missing something. It just never felt complete. And then now, as an adult who could almost definitely pass the ADD screening test, I also realized why sitting in mass was so hard for me, just listening to some guy talk for an hour.
Mhm.
And so it was boring and it felt like it was missing something. And in college, I learned all this, and I just kept taking religious studies courses. And I always told, ironically, that, I went to school to work with animals, which I did through all of my 20s, that if I wasn't going to work with animals, I would go get a PhD in comparative religion and teach comparative religion at the college level. And now I do shadow work, which is very psychological. I do religious studies because, and I do the magic piece with my clients because I do think that the scholarship and the understanding of the history really, really helps. But anyway, so then I kind of let that go while I was doing my whole dog training thing and working with horses and just all that stuff, which was amazing. And then Megan Watterson published Mary Magdalene Revealed. And I sort of rediscovered then the Gospel of Mary. And Megan in that book put words to something that I didn't even know I needed words for. And then I bought her Oracle deck, and then I bought more books on Mary Magdalene, and then I bought a tarot deck, and then they would just all, then that was just that. I never kind of looked back. And I remember, having numerous, kind of like you were saying, you had a reading, my first spiritual mentor, my second spiritual mentor, they're like, I think you're going to teach this someday. And I was like, no, no, no. Like, I love my dog training business. Here I am. Now this is my entire life. It's all I do or think about or talk about. Um, and of course, as I'm learning about Mary Magdalene, then I'm learning about the history of the devil, and then I'm learning about the Garden of Eden, and then I'm learning about Lilith, and I'm just like, none of this was actually told to me the way it originally was meant to show up in scripture. And then I'm learning about Avalon, and all of a sudden, it's my entire life.
Yeah.
And because I am, I think this is because I did a biology degree and a psychology degree. I love to research. I love to study. I love to understand things.
Right.
But I'm bad with numbers. So I did really well in psychology. I did really well in history, in those courses where it was about concepts and peeling away layers and getting to the root of things, which makes sense with all my heavy Scorpio placements as well. So,
Oh, yeah. Understanding us on an astrological level helps explain things for sure.
yeah, lots and lots of Scorpio placements in my chart. I think there's like 5 really big ones. So,
I'm heavy on the Taurus.
yeah.
Very, very, very much earthy person here. But yeah, I know it's so awesome. And when you mentioned Avalon, I thought about the book. Have you read Horns of the Goddess by Dolores Cannon?
No, but I'll have to add to my list if it's a good
Yeah,
one.
it's cool. You know Dolores Cannon, right? Do you know who she is?
It sounds fairly familiar.
She does like
Can't quite place it.
hypnotherapy, or she's passed away, but like her
Mhm.
practice was like doing hypnotherapy on people and bringing them to past lives and basically interviewing people in time.
Yeah.
Like, so getting an understanding of that time period. And part of it kind of
Mm.
crosses over into all time is now, and it's concurrent with now, which can always blow your mind.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing you don't think about too hard. You
Yeah,
just,
your brain just melts and you have to like stop and look.
exactly. You just accept it and you don't think about it too hard.
Well, she wrote this book. Well, she was studying to write this book when she passed away in 2014. And then like they cobbled it together and published it like a year or two ago.
Mhm.
And the Horns of the Goddess, she's talking to someone who is a druid. Or like in the Avalon priestess time
Mhm.
period when the church was coming for them. So
Yeah.
fucking amazing. Like you'd love it. But yeah, like there's I'm drawn to so much of it, so many aspects of it. And the Gnostics and the Cathars and all of that.
Mhm.
It's like like I got all the books too, back in I guess 2021, including the ones you mentioned, and then some. I don't even
Yeah.
know. I have a shelf in my bedroom with all of them. But yeah, it's just like, where do you begin? And there's so much, but like, I'm glad that it's gaining momentum right now more and more. I mean, of course, it's my algorithm. So who knows in there, outside of my algorithm,
I had that thought this morning about my Instagram feed.
it's everywhere. It's like, well, it's everywhere I'm looking. But but I love seeing it in it's more and more pronounced because there is a
Mhm.
rise of the divine feminine right now because we're so grossly imbalanced and it's just
Yes.
awful, awful, awful. And what was the name of the book? Braiding Sweetgrass. I don't know if you've
I
heard of it.
have that. It's on my shelf.
Yeah,
I have a 3-year-old, so I have collected quite a few books in the last couple years to read that are just
I know. I
waiting
have like
for
a
me to have the
pile of
time.
osmosis books next to my bed. Like maybe I'm just getting the information.
Yeah.
But that was just another reminder of like our connection to Earth and like what we've lost.
Hmm.
So it's a drag that we're so far upside down, but it's also like righting itself now, and it's
Yeah.
it's freaking amazing. Like we're here for it. So whenever I find anything up, like I have a witch on my door at work, and it's like witch isn't a bad word. Like my goal is to like demystify
Hmm.
anything like the pentagram, pentacle, like none of that's bad. None of that's bad. So I'm always just like emphatically trying to tell people that it's just the programming we were given. etc. And then when we were, I forget what call I was on with you, whatever class you taught, however, whatever, a few weeks ago, but you were mentioning the witch wound as just like just an offshoot real quick. And I was like, oh, that would be great. And then when you asked, like, what should we talk about? Like witch wound and the devil, like
Yeah.
that's just so cool. And you have your own podcast. What's it called? I forget.
The Reclamation Hour.
Okay.
Hmm.
And I'm appreciating that, like each week that you release episodes, I'm on it. And I just appreciate all of the tangents and all of the everything that comes up in the conversations. It's been great. So I just wanted to like do our due diligence in sharing it further, and amplifying this message more so. So what and cool. And I was thinking, I'm like, I gotta create another podcast because I always have these cool stories of like what happens with my clients and stuff. And I probably will still make this podcast, but the idea that I wanted to share was something that happened recently with a Reiki attunement. I've had several in the Reiki attunements that I give where I see people, in their most recent traumatic life. So
Yeah.
I'm like popping them in, making them a Reiki healer, and then I see them hanging, or I see them like there was a woman who was like vomiting. I'm like, oh, I think you were poisoned in a past life, and she's like, I'm like, do you believe in past lives? I was like, oh wait, I don't know if you're even willing to like take this information, but I've seen all sorts of crazy stuff, impalement, eyes sewn shut. So we've had a shitload of damage.
Hmm.
If we're born to do this work or be a healer, or even, I mean, I'm sure it's not everyone, but it's everyone that's a healer or drawn to the divine feminine, probably had a traumatic ending in another time. So, and I still feel like I have a little bit of, there's another layer to resolve on my own that I know it's trying to think that it's keeping me safe.
Yeah.
Like, okay, thanks for the lesson, but maybe we can release this. I haven't pulled that one all the way out yet, but I know it's
Hmm.
lingering, and that's next. But yeah, we have all these damages. So if you can summarize or go into the witch wound, that'd be great.
Hmm. Yeah. So the witch wound is the one that, tells us it's not safe to be magical or to be in our power or to use our voice or to do any type of healing work, or it's that whole wounding that we have around, yes, witchcraft and magical things directly, but also just using your voice, taking up space. So this is where, you know, on my own journey, I wasn't raised in a house that was like all hell and brimstone. You know what I mean? It wasn't like I remember having a tarot deck at one point for like 2 seconds and then I lost it as a child. But I wasn't raised in a home where that conditioning was really embedded in me in this lifetime. And so then as I was a young adult and as I started to get into, sacred feminine spirituality, I had to really reckon with like, why is all of this in me anyway? Why am I carrying all this fear and all this wounding and all this conditioning around the patriarchy and Christianity and going to hell and all of this stuff when that wasn't taught to me? And so it can really come through, I think, in a couple different ways. So first of all, if you believe in past lives, if that's something that resonates with you, is that if you're magical now, this is not your first magical life. And I'm using the term magical very broadly. Okay, so I don't necessarily mean you're sitting down doing what we would call witchcraft. Like maybe you're reading tarot, maybe you're just meditating, maybe you're sitting in ceremony, like whatever that looks like for you. If your soul has already incarnated, let me say that again. If you are magical now, it is likely you have had a magical past life.
Mhm.
And it is likely that that did not end well
Yeah.
for you because the witch trials, we think about the witch trials in Salem, right? Like a dozen women or something. Horrifying, absolutely. But hundreds of thousands of people were killed in Europe over about 600 years, give or take, specifically for witchcraft and also just for heresy, right? Like the church created their inquisitions and things. And so if your soul has already lived through this once, it remembers
Mhm.
and it is terrified to go through that again.
Yeah.
Now, if past lives don't resonate with you, that's okay because you're still probably experiencing a witch wound epigenetically. And this is where even if, somebody's not had a very magical past life because that's just not their incarnation cycle, if your ancestor anywhere in your lineage, going back at least 7 generations, which is 150 people, and gets us back into at least like think Bridgerton, Pride and Prejudice, like that time era in England. If any of your ancestors witnessed a witch trial, participated in a witch trial, heard about the witch trials, your physical body has encoded that. And so this is where I get into the field of epigenetics and how our genetics encode, we actually carry and encode things like trauma and pass it down from generation to generation. And it changes how we perceive stress, how we um, handle stress, how, all of these, it changes our trauma responses. So whether we're looking at this from a past life perspective, whether we're looking at this from an epigenetic perspective, if you're going to go into, depth psychology and look at like the collective unconscious, these witch trials have affected all of us. And they've leaked into society since then. So while, the general society in the United States, for example, doesn't even really believe witchcraft is real, we still see the effects of it today. So, for example, like people are already nervous about the pentagram. That's just because that's embedded in our psyche that as this like symbol now. We look at, sisterhood wounds are very intertwined with the witch wound because this is the one where it's not safe to shine too brightly or to be too successful because other women might tear you down. Well, in the witch trials, that literally happened. Women would have to give, I wouldn't be killed if I gave you up.
Right.
Okay. That causes a very significant wound in our psyche.
Yeah.
And so the witch wound really comes through in a lot of ways for people. And it tends to be something we peel away layers for a really long time, especially if you're somebody who is, in this lifetime doing any type of healer or spiritual work, because again, you've probably done this in numerous lives before. And so odds are it's either ended badly for you or you've watched it end badly for the people around you.
Right.
And when we start to talk about these archetypal wounding, it's really easy to accidentally go down the shame route or something like that. But kind of like you already mentioned, it's really just trying to keep you safe. Like your psyche, your soul, your epigenetic imprints, like it's all just trying to keep this from happening to you again. So we want to honor that while also releasing it because shame is also very much at the root of almost all of our feminine wounding going all the way back to the Garden of Eden story. And shaming ourselves is not how we actually heal any of this. And so I think it's always important to kind of mention that because it's very ingrained in women to go down the shame spiral
Oh, I
in
liked
an
how you
attempt to be
started.
good.
Yeah. Well, like when you started the class about um the story of Adam and Eve and like just
Hmm.
automatically like the stories we've been told, like they really are ingrained in us, whether we were raised in that environment or not. It's
Yeah.
just part of the collective psyche. And I know
Hmm.
it's like I kind of enjoy triggering people by putting these symbols out there because I want them to like look at it, look into it, like
Hmm.
like they recognize that. I mean, whatever they think of me, but I think I'm a pretty normal person, like like more
Yeah.
grounded and stuff. So you're like, okay, well, it can't be all that bad if she's talking about it, So like
Hmm.
that's just part of the demystifying of all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And yeah, I remember the first time I made like a social media post about something spiritual. I don't even remember what it was, but I remember where I was. I remember like sitting in front of
Yeah.
my and my hands were shaking and like it was like probably 2010 or something like that.
Hmm.
It's like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm like scared to like say this, because
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, because it's vulnerable and you're exposed.
Hmm.
So yeah, I know. And like, have you heard about like, like if you look at like the rings around your neck, like that's how many times you probably lost your head or were hung.
No, but I mean,
I
we
think,
definitely do see like physical markings and physical injuries
yeah,
show up in this life on your body in different ways too. So it doesn't surprise me.
yeah, I know. It is interesting. And my one friend always says, you're like surrounded by like the Morrigan and like that whole like part of the world's like magical
Hmm.
energies. And I just go, okay, like I haven't connected with them, but I know that like that Celtic, like in the Scandinavian like lineages are like
Hmm.
behind me, but I'm not aware of any of my family being witchy. because why would I?
Yeah.
It wasn't in my
Right.
mom that she said out loud, like she made a joke where she like made like the little devil fingers at my brother and was like, I curse you with the child of your own, like just like you. It was like the only witchy thing my mom. And I think that my sister found a letter where my mom said something like, when they all of the women circled around my sister's firstborn, it was like a coven. And she's like, oh my God, mom used the word coven. But otherwise it wasn't
Yeah.
like, you know,
Yeah.
who knows like where the damage came from in the epigenetic line of things.
Yeah.
But I mean, being of Irish descent and being from the Scandinavian, like I'm sure we had lots of
Mhm.
experiences up the line that we'll be privy to if we get the access of a past life, whatever, or some kind of psychic insight, but I don't otherwise know about it. Oh, did you see the tartan that they made for Scotland? It's a new thing.
Mm-mm.
Just
No.
all over my feed now. But they designed a new tartan with the witch for the witches that were killed during the great.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I did hear about this.
Yeah, yeah, I thought that was neat. But
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. And then the other aspect of what I was curious that you could like teach us is about like the creation of the devil.
hmm
And like I haven't done a deep dive into that, but I do know that like I was doing a meditation many years ago and I saw a goddess with antlers and I was like,
hmm
who is the goddess with antlers? And then I realized that many goddesses present that way, but
Yeah, like a lot. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, but I didn't even know that that was a thing. And so
hmm
like the antlers and then the crescent being a thing for women,
hmm
and the horns, and that's like horns of the goddess, and that was inverted and turned into the devil. Like that's like my quick over the glossy overview. Like that's how like or like
Yeah.
like the nature gods that people
hmm
were, I guess, praying to or connecting to. That's where oh, it's not a priest, so therefore it's evil. Like, is that how it came? Like, what? Tell me.
Yeah, I mean, so the patriarchy already is, mostly in place before Christianity comes into existence. And I think that that's something important to understand, especially because, I've said this before on my podcast, but like, there's a wounded piece of me that would still just love to blame Christianity for everything. But I mean, really, the Romans were already very patriarchal before
Yeah.
they like took Christianity on.
Sure.
Um, and so we see lots of horned, or I'm going to use the word horned deity as an archetype. And we see those all throughout Europe. So we see goddesses and gods with antlers. And so you think about like Cernunnos, you think about Pan, you think about all these different horned gods that are usually associated with the wild places, with the forest, with male sexuality. And so we see all of that still happening in Europe where we have associated that archetype with the masculine. So we see the implementation of the patriarchy before we see those traits become evil, which is what Christianity adds to the story. But the devil, the myth of the devil that we're mostly familiar with in the West, right, is like Satan slash Lucifer, who, led this big grand war against God, fell from heaven, and now he's trying to win souls for hell, right? Like he's the king of hell. This is the Christian, tradition that has popped up. And so we can blame the devil for the bad things in the world because he's like tempting people and all that. But this devil myth actually comes from at least three separate beings, mythologies, or archetypes that the church over time evolved into one. So when we go all the way back to the Garden of Eden, which really is a super important story in the collective conscious because it shaped the course of Western society in numerous ways. The idea is that it was the devil who tempted Eve. The devil isn't in the Genesis story. The word used literally just means snake.
Mm.
Like it is just a snake that talks to Eve. And the people who wrote that story and the people who circulated the story and were understanding the story at the time would have understood that the serpent is actually a symbol of the goddess.
Mm.
So the devil isn't in the Garden of Eden story. And, ancient Hebrew has words for evil spirits, it has words for Satan. It could have used those words, and it didn't. It just uses the word for snake. Like, that's it, full stop. Lucifer is pinned as the devil because of one phrase in the Bible, which something about, I can never quite remember it because it's not super important to me to be able to quote the Bible. But, how Lucifer has fallen. And there's a one term about that in Isaiah, I think. But the word Lucifer is actually just means morning star. And it's being used as a sort of insult
And
towards the king of Babylon.
Morning Star is Venus, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's an insult about how this king has fallen from grace, just like the planet Venus descends and then reascends again.
Mm-hmm.
So Lucifer, the fallen angel, is not in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Lucifer does mean morning star and actually has his roots in the Venus tradition, where the name Lucifer is the masculine aspect of Venus.
Mm-hmm.
And so as Christianity comes, up into Rome, it comes into contact with Venus temples that are still active and using the word Lucifer and doing things like sacred sexual rites and very Venusian, like in all the ways. And Venus has her crescent moon on the top of her head that kind of look like horns. She has a consort that has horns. Diana and all of these other Diana and Artemis, like these other very empowered goddesses that Christianity is coming into contact with are often depicted with horns themselves or have, you know, consorts with horns. And then it comes into contact with all the horned gods, particularly Pan in the beginning. And all of this starts to get turned into one thing. But what I want to mention about Lucifer before I hit the Satan part, because that's actually a third separate myth, is that Lucifer falling from grace in heaven, that story doesn't get really fleshed out until 1664. Okay, so 500 years ago, in Milton's Paradise Lost, which is an epic poem about how God has become tyrannical. And these angels start this war and then they fall and they end up in hell. What's important to understand about Milton is that he is coming on the heels of Shakespeare and he wants to be the next great poet. So his goal in life is to outwrite Shakespeare. He gets sidetracked when he becomes a part of the group that is trying to end the monarchy in England. Not switch who the king is, but actually just abolish monarchy. They are ultimately unsuccessful. So he writes Paradise Lost after having just failed an attempt to overthrow what they had deemed a tyrannical monarchy. So in Milton's story, God isn't the good guy. All right? And there's a good case to be made that he's in fact the bad guy. And so we really get this grand war against God in Milton's Paradise Lost in 1664. Now, people will bring up the Book of Enoch, and yes, you get fallen angel mythology from there, absolutely. But it's not this big grand war until we see Milton's Paradise Lost. And so when we actually talk about Lucifer, so again, we already mentioned kind of the horned gods as one archetype that has created the devil myth. And we talk about Lucifer as a separate archetype mythology being who has been wound up in the devil myth. He is actually a light bringer archetype. He carries the same frequencies as Jesus. Like we're actually looking at the same archetype when we look at Lucifer and we look at the Ascended Master Jesus, which is not a conversation a lot of people are willing to have, but is absolutely true. And both Jesus and Lucifer actually very heavily carry sacred feminine wisdom with them in their mythologies. And so then Satan, being the third being wrapped up in this, is the, ancient Judaic, Hebrew word that just means adversary. So when we actually see Satan first appear in the Old Testament, he is just working on behalf of God. And anybody can fulfill this role. It's not a specific being. Then it becomes a title. And then it eventually becomes a proper noun, being the name of one specific being. But it requires hundreds of years for Satan to evolve from somebody who's actually working on behalf of God, much like a prosecutor in a courtroom works on behalf of the law, to an evil being
Right.
And we don't see him get wrapped up with Lucifer and put in the Garden of Eden until like the turn of the turn of the millennia. I'd have to pull up my timeline because I really am bad at dates. So usually I have a whole timeline of this stuff on my computer. So I mean that's kind of the overview. Like it's just three very separate mythologies and we can see how they very directly become tied with anything earth-based, anything sexuality-based, anything sacred feminine based.
Mhm.
And it uses the Garden of Eden story to say, and this is why men need to be above women because the devil tempted Eve in the Garden of Eden. And it's not what the scripture says. This is the tradition that has popped up, but it's not actually what any of the scriptures say.
I had a friend who she was a powerful healer and she had like pointy edges, you know, and I remember like her being like, you should work with Lucifer. And I was like, oh, never. I would never work with Lucifer. That and she's like, no, it's fine. And I was like, I'm not sure
Hmm.
about that. And then I remember talking to somebody else and she's like, no, because she also, like didn't know the
Hmm.
whole story. And I can't say I have worked with Lucifer, but I remember how like triggering that was to hear her suggest that it wasn't
Yeah.
evil or the devil or Satan or whatever.
Hmm.
My husband is a skeptic atheist, and
Yeah.
we went to, of course,
I mean, my husband, like, I think I'd label him agnostic because a lot of times he's like, no, no, I don't believe in anything. And then every now and then something will come out of his mouth. And I'm like, so you do believe in like some type of greater power?
well, we went to Salem like 2 years ago, and there's the Church of Satan or
Hmm.
Satanism, or
Yeah, there's a couple.
I forget
Yeah.
what's the it, it's not Satan worship.
Right.
It's what's the name of the guy that starts with a B? Baphomet, but
Baphomet. Yep. So Baphomet's actually a separate, like I always, when I teach about it, I teach about Baphomet as one of the many horned, deities that got wrapped up in this myth.
yeah.
So,
So like we went to the I can't remember if it's called the Church of Satan or the Church of whatever, but whatever it is, it's just meant to trigger people about religion. Like that's
mhm.
their whole purpose. Isn't
Yeah.
They're not a religion. They're an atheistic organization that likes to push buttons and
Yeah.
hold on for religious truth and stuff. So like I in the very beginning, I didn't even want to entertain the things that my husband was saying about that stuff because I was just so triggered by it. But then like
Hmm.
a decade or so has passed, so it doesn't trigger me like it did. And so when we were there, I'm like, sure, I'll go here, and we took pictures by his statue, but I couldn't post them online because I don't want anyone to like turn it around and be like, look how evil Karen
Well,
is.
this is an example of the
Yeah.
witch wound. And because during the witch trials, women and witchcraft and all of this stuff was directly being tied to the devil. Like if you were accused of witchcraft,
Yeah.
it was because you were in league with the devil.
Right.
And our bodies and our souls like remember that. And
Yeah.
I even struggle with that. Like Lucifer I work with that whole pantheon that Christians would just love me using that word for their one God. But the entire pantheon, Mary Magdalene, Asherah, Eve, Lilith, Lucifer, all of them. And it's still, I teach a whole workshop on the devil. We spend 2 weeks with Lucifer. And it's still hard for me to be
Yeah.
to talk about because it's really, there's a very deeply ingrained somatic response. And I think it's a problem that the spiritual community really needs to work on.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And that Baphomet, he is well hung and he's erect. It's crazy. That
mhm,
that statue was quite intense, to be nearby. And like I think I remember you saying it maybe in your podcast or something about like the devil card and tarot being kind of
mhm,
after him.
yes.
So I know it's
Yep.
just so it's there's so many layers to all of it, and just speaking truth to it, and even
Yeah.
all of the language. Like that was another like subset in my idea for a class that I was going to never teach, but um, was the different words that like
Hmm.
undoing the damage of the words, and like sin, and
Hmm.
crone, and like a million others. But like, doesn't sin just mean like left of center or like miss the mark or off the mark?
Yeah. I mean, originally the concept of sin just meant you missed the mark. It
Yeah.
wasn't some huge transgression against God. It was just like you tried to be human and you kind of messed it up, so like try again.
Yeah. And then virgin, and virgin
Right.
doesn't mean never had sex. Is
Right.
it
Originally it was more about like a woman who wasn't owned by anyone or something
I
along
couldn't
the
remember,
lines of
yeah.
that.
But there was like a whole list of like the words being like, this is even what
Hmm.
we've been taught so so wrong for so long.
Hmm.
It's just exhausting.
Yeah, well, and that's, so when I speak about the patriarchy, I just always like to really be clear. Like, I'm not speaking about men as individuals. I mean, there are some men as individuals who are a problem, but like, I'm not speaking about like men. I'm speaking about a system.
Right.
And the patriarchy did this on purpose. They took our symbols, they took our concepts, they took our deities, they took all of these things and they inverted it so that we would think it was evil.
Hmm.
And then when it awakens in us naturally, we then believe we are evil, whether that be consciously or unconsciously. And sometimes I just also want to mention that it doesn't show up as am I evil? It also sometimes shows up as am I crazy?
Hmm.
And so when we start to be drawn to a pentagram, or we start to be drawn to serpents or dragons, or we feel our sexuality awaken, or we're really interested in tarot or something like that, we start to wonder, am I crazy? Am I evil? Is there something wrong with me? No, no, this is very, very normal feminine stuff to be interested in.
Right.
Women's power has always been in their sexuality. Crones, for example, of course they went after our crones. Those were our wisdom keepers. We're one of only like 3 species where the females go through menopause, which means there's a biological function for us to have women in society who are no longer having their own children. It
Right.
means that there's an advantage to that. So of course they went after our crones because our crones were holding all the wisdom. And, like it was all very, very intentional. And so when we look at something like whenever, what I want to say here is whenever you feel that, is this an evil thing, but I'm so weirdly drawn to it or triggered by it, you really need to look at why. Why do you believe it's evil? Who told you it was evil? Why did they tell you it was evil? Lucifer is a light bringer. He's an enlightener. He helps us to break free of things. I don't, that sounds like a good thing to me,
Yeah.
but we've been taught to believe that that would be bad.
Right.
So there's
And
always a reason.
yeah, successful propaganda, like
Hmm.
I forget how it was worded, something, but just like to think that we're the problem, to wake up and think that we're like then it's like, well,
Hmm.
yeah, then we're easier to control.
Well, we don't have to burn witches anymore, or because the witch trials really just turned into psychiatry, which now can be very helpful for people. But at the beginning, psychiatry was very bleak. Um, we don't have to burn witches anymore if we can just put them in psychiatric institutions. And we don't have to put them in psychiatric institutions if we can just get them to police themselves and each other.
Yeah. I know.
So,
I know a woman who said that an early memory for her, and she's like in her 50s, was seeing her neighbor being like taken out to like the mental hospital because she
mhm.
talks to angels.
Yeah.
Like, geez Louise, it's like so awful that, and somebody I was reading about today said her mother, was deemed crazy because of her gifts. So we're like,
Mhm.
it's very recent.
Yes. And I want to mention, like I don't know about your audience and like just who tends to be in your audience, but like as white women, like I can only speak from the perspective of a white woman because that's the body that I'm in this lifetime. We were severed from our roots
Oh, geez, like generations.
exactly, before we severed other people's from their roots. And so it's been even longer for us since we had the safety nets and the training and the guardrails and the traditions that we should have access to. Um, so when our gifts come online, sometimes we feel like we're crazy, and it isn't just conditioning, it's because there's no one there to help us
Hmm.
understand what's happening.
Right.
And there used to be.
Yeah.
Pre-patriarchy, there used to be.
Yeah. Whole communities. Like I
Hmm.
said, I just started reading that book. What's the good girl? Like whatever the seven sins, but
Uh-huh.
like just the communities that you would be supported
Hmm.
by, versus the vertical family structure, as I was just reading last night, and it's like that
Yep.
isolating and disempowering that can be.
Exactly, which is why I love that book. So that's Elise Loenin's book, On Our Best Behavior.
Okay.
And she does just such a fantastic job of explaining how all of this has seeped into modern day society. And
Mhm.
this is where, I kind of mentioned before, like I hit, sort of mid 20s, late 20s, and I'm like, why? why is all of this in me? Like, how did I pick up any of this conditioning? This doesn't make any sense to me.
Hmm.
Why am I so afraid to, like, for example, I am married to like the safest man on the planet. Like, he never takes out his frustration on me, ever. And when he has a bad day at work and it has nothing to do with me, I feel wildly unsafe.
Hmm.
Why? He's never done anything. I was raised with a father who was a yeller, but not at me. He was not abusive in any way.
Right.
So, like, where the hell does that come from?
Yeah.
Oh, it comes from the last 1500 years where the only safe way to be a woman was to be married to a man and to keep him happy with you. And if he wasn't happy with you, you weren't safe. So it's like, oh, that's why I feel so wildly unsafe when my husband just comes home from work in a bad mood and it has nothing to do with me and he's not taking it out on me in any way.
Yeah.
This, it is so ingrained in our bodies and in society that it can be really, really hard to see, but
Mhm.
it affects almost every aspect of our daily lives.
And also like the point you made in the class where talking about like the stories were told and embedded.
Hmm.
Like if the story was told differently, how different would our world be? You know,
Well,
like
right. So, the Garden of Eden story, everybody knows the Garden of Eden story, even if you weren't raised Christian.
mm,
And so, what if instead of the story you were raised with in society, the one that shaped society, wasn't the devil tricked Eve into eating the forbidden fruit, and then she tricked Adam into eating the forbidden fruit, and this is why sin and death and destruction entered the world, and it's all her fault? What if the story was the goddess came to Eve and, initiated her into wisdom and into the understanding that life requires us to know good and evil. It requires us to see all of these things. And then she initiated Adam, and through this process, the human race was awakened. I mean,
yeah.
it's wildly different, but I have just as much scriptural evidence, if not more, for my version of the story.
And Mary Magdalene, not
Hmm.
the whore, but being the high priestess who anointed Jesus. And,
Exactly.
I love that. And I love that like moon magic. I'm like, oh, Mary Magdalene. Like,
Yeah.
she's a regular as well. It's
But
just
that happens to so many women where you don't even really know what you're doing. And like you know what you're doing, but like in hindsight, you're like, no wonder I used those symbols. No wonder I used that, those words or that, because it was awakening inside of you. It didn't, these are not things that have to be taught. These are things we know if we can just strip away the layers of conditioning.
totally. And that was like the cool thing about discovering it. It was like ravens and owls and
Hmm.
tree of life and the
Yeah.
flower, the sacred geometry, like the one that's behind me, like the
Hmm.
flower, this is it the flower of life and then the seed of life, whatever, all
Hmm.
the different sacred geometry things. I'm trying to think what else, but just like stars and the moon, it's like so cool. And I
Yeah.
had no idea that Venus was even, like I didn't know any of it. So I'm like so grateful that it all, I have my my logo on my sweatshirt. But like, it's so cool. And it's like,
Yeah.
yes, I'm grateful that society has finally caught up or is catching up and like this information is
Hmm.
being shared. Um, and I don't know how it's going to look in how long it's going to be before there's balance. And like the opposite, it's
I
not the
know.
opposite. It's not matriarchy to be empowering men. It's supposed to
Exactly.
be equality
Yeah,
aspect.
and I think that's important for people to understand is that when somebody like myself talks about a matriarchy and how we lived before the patriarchy, I'm not talking about an inversion. I'm not talking about women having more privilege than men or being in charge of men or taking over the government or anything like that. I'm talking about bringing things back into balance,
Mm-hmm.
talking about equality. Although when we look back at those societies, and again, this goes to like why the human species has women who go through menopause is because those were often the women who were leading the village, leading the tribe, making the decisions, like the wise grandmothers. This is
Mm-hmm.
a arguably more biologically natural way for human society to organize. And it's not about oppressing men.
Right.
It's just about bringing the women back in. I'm not trying to tear down the masculine. I'm just trying to like bring the sacred feminine also. Like, can we just have both?
Like
You know,
just
like
take your boot off our neck. That's all we're saying.
exactly. I mean, so many people, like when we talk, I just get so passionate about like the Christian pantheon stuff a lot because it's like a lot of people don't even know like God had a wife until she was removed from the stories.
Right.
Like
Wow. I
the
mean, and the
sacred
fact that
feminine used to be there.
these stories like, and I'm so grateful for the Cathars. I mean, I'm not even totally sure, like Cathars and Gnostics, and like where, like, are they
Yeah.
merged? Are they the same? Like, I never figured all of this out, but like the Cathar prophecy, there's something about
Mhm.
like, now it's basically like now is when like the information's coming forward, which was cool. I remember
Yeah.
reading something about that. It was like in 1300 when the last Cathar was killed. I'm pretty sure it was the Cathar. Um, where they were prophesizing like in 700 years, and it was,
Yeah.
I remember reading that and being like, it's now.
Oh, I know. I know.
And then like the text of the Gospel of Mary, like
Hmm.
there were some, the Gnostics or the Cathars, I don't know, somebody hid it in the vases or whatever, so it wasn't
Yep.
discovered until like the late 1800s. It's like, holy
Yeah.
man, like they really went out of their way to erase any evidence, like.
Well, yeah, so one of the points that I like to bring up is right, it's about the fourth century when the Christian canon forms up, okay, when we start to
Right.
have a Bible, because you can't have a Bible until you can have a book.
Hmm.
And you can't have a book until the fourth century. Until then, there are all of these other scriptures floating around that are being seen as authoritative. The Gospel of Mary, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, where Paul preaches with a woman for the remainder of his life, the Pistis Sophia, the Thunder Perfect Mind, where God is a woman, or God is, where all of this feminine stuff is also floating around. And the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Philip, like all of these different scriptures. And after they form up the Christian canon, an edict goes out to destroy all of this. So, there's a combination of sort of natural human evolution, which I would say is just systemic patriarchy. And then there are very clear moments in history that are decisions by men in power to take down the sacred feminine. And that would be one of those moments where they decided this is what Christianity is, everything else is heretical, destroy it. Well, everything else was the stuff that included the women.
Yeah.
It was.
Yeah.
So this is the stuff we need to bring back. This is the stuff that we need to bring back into our lives and into, culture in
Hmm.
general.
I know. And was it like Pope Gregory? Was that
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
that was at that time? I know
Let
there
me,
wasn't there a second Pope Gregory?
yeah, actually, I think there's been like nine
I know.
Pope
I feel like
Gregories.
there was like Pope Gregory the fourth or the fifth or somebody. But I know you're just
I
like,
know.
this is all just, it's all just propaganda. It's like our whole foundation is like, you question everything once you start to like peel it back and.
Yeah, but I mean, it's true. So it was the Bishop of Ant. I just opened up my timeline. I don't know how to pronounce this bishop. So in 367, it wasn't Pope Gregory. It was a Bishop of Alexandria who put out an edict to destroy all the other gospels.
Uh-huh.
It was Pope Gregory, that he's not on this timeline, but this one I'd remember, who decided that Mary Magdalene was the repentant prostitute, that Jesus had had cast seven demons out of, who he said were the seven deadly sins, and attributed them all to Mary Magdalene, just like all in one fell swoop there, just all at once. Um, we don't even get like original sin until somewhere in the fourth century. Like this is all in the last 15 to 2000 years, and 1500 to 2000 years. And while that sounds old,
Hmm.
what I want people to understand is that human history is not 2000 years. Human history is much older.
Right.
And we have, just for example, like the Venus of Willendorf, or there's a German one that I can't pronounce, that are like 40 to 20,000 years old. And these are figurines of the goddess. So, when I say 1500 years ago, like that's recent human history.
Hmm.
This
Yeah,
is not how things have been done for the vast majority of it.
I know. And it's like 3,000 years or so, or 3,500, 30, whatever. Because
Yeah.
it was before a thousand years plus before Jesus, that all of that anti, the
Yeah.
suppression of women and stuff came into
Yeah,
being.
and it starts kind of in the is it the Bronze Age? It starts as humans change from hunter-gatherer societies into agrarian societies, and then it slowly, the patriarchy slowly starts to kick in. And then the Greeks become very patriarchal, the Romans become very patriarchal, Christianity comes in with the fuel
Hmm.
to formalize, the patriarchal structures, because it's the one that says, I have scriptural evidence for why this is how things need to be the way they are.
Meanwhile, Jesus is like revolutionary because he's trying to prop women up and like support that, but like that part got.
Right. Even if you just stick to canonical gospels, you can see that Jesus was very pro women
Mhm.
and that Mary Magdalene was obviously very important.
Yeah,
Even if we just stick to what actually is still in the Bible.
right. Yeah, I remember
So,
you talking about that too. I mean, like, well, I can't say with evidence, but I do believe that he was married to her and they had kids, you know.
yeah.
Like,
Yeah, there's, and that's where we get into like, Mary Magdalene, like we have scriptural evidence for she was definitely the partner in Jesus's ministry.
mhm.
I mean, that's fairly obvious when you look at scriptures in the Bible and outside of the Bible, and you know what you're looking for and you have the historical context. Then there's a lot of personal gnosis, which with some evidence to support the fact that maybe they were sexual partners, that maybe they had kids together. I mean, there's a lot of folklore around Mary Magdalene and her daughter landing in France after, Jesus' execution. Like there's a lot here. And when you know the historical context, you can see it in these scriptures. So, for example, Mary Magdalene is who anoints Jesus. If you have the historical context around what an anointing is, that's not something like a random street prostitute is not going to have access to the oils described in the canonical gospels. She's
Right.
just not. And she wouldn't have had her hair down. Jewish women would not have just had their hair down or exposed like that. Um, the anointing is actually a very big deal and a very big spiritual deal that probably would have required training. And that's before we even get into like, was she performing sacred sexual rites? Because when we talk about prostitution today, is very different than sacred sex that would have been happening inside of temples, which has been wrapped up with prostitution, but is actually not the way we view it today. And that's not a comment on sex work today. It's just we're really looking at two different things
Right.
that the patriarchy has just decided is actually one thing.
And Mother Mary was also a priestess, wasn't she?
Almost definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, almost, and again, like even if we just look at the canonical texts, it's like whenever an angel comes to someone in the Bible, the first thing they say is, do not be afraid, because angels are objectively terrifying. They don't say that when the angel comes to Mary, which means she's done this before.
Yeah.
Like she's familiar with angels in some capacity.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, there is quite a bit of evidence that suggests, Mary, both the Marys, Mother Mary and Mary Magdalene, funded Jesus's movement.
Yeah.
These are not things that we learned about in church.
Right.
So,
Grateful just to like have this conversation and like to go, in all these directions because it's like it's so
yeah,
just nice to kind of marinate in it and be like, yes, 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 like I know this.
I
And
know. And the through line, because sometimes when we talk about the sacred feminine, especially when it's two people who are like really excited about it, it feels a little bit like we're jumping around from topic to topic. But the through line here really is that the sacred feminine used to be very normal,
Mhm.
that God was either a woman or was both.
Mhm.
And the erasure and the villainization of the sacred feminine was very intentional. The Garden of Eden and the devil were two of the key ways that the Christian patriarchy erased and villainized the sacred feminine. And by the time we get to Jesus and Mary Magdalene, they're probably trying to fix it. And that's just not how it goes down in history. So,
Nope. I know. And yeah, whatever. I can talk up forever, but I'll let you go. You have a family. But thank you so much. I'm thinking about the Ankh and I'm thinking about Inanna, but I'm like, all right.
exactly, but it's all connected. And so Venus is going to go retrograde here in a couple of days. So I'm just going to mention this quick because it's going to be a big deal. And so I do have a podcast where Alexandra and I talk about Venus
Mhm.
because she's an astrologer, my co-host on my podcast. She hits the astrology part, and I talked about the mythology. The Venus cycle and Inanna are the almost origin point in some ways for most of our sacred feminine mythology. But we do have a podcast on that, which I will just pitch, but primarily because Venus retrograde, like today's the 27th of February. I think it's March 1st that it goes. So we're probably already retrograde by the time this
What
is posted.
what would you say
But
is a flagship experience of this combination of things?
Venus retrograde.
Yeah, because isn't it in Mars, or wasn't it in Mars?
I'm I cannot remember.
But like I just know it's like shit hits it gets intense because
So Venus is about, she's not just about love, although she is love and relationships. She's also about, you know, women's rights and women's reproductive. The last time being, if she's going retrograde in Aries,
yeah,
I can't remember.
maybe it's because I'm thinking like Mars or Aries, like that kind
Yeah,
of energy. Yeah,
I can't remember. But the last she goes she hits. It's got to be Aries. But she goes retrograde every 18 months, I think. But it's an 8 year cycle.
right.
The last time she went retrograde in this sign was 8 years ago when President Trump was inaugurated the first time.
Yeah, that with
We're hitting the beginning of that 8 year cycle again.
mm-hmm.
So things are going to be intense and we're going to be asked to look at our priorities and those, of society. Like you have to listen to Alexandra talk about it because I'm just not the astrologer.
Right.
But Venus goes retrograde and she descends. Her whole mythology of the planet is that she goes into the underworld and she comes back up. Like this is where we get Inanna's mythology into the underworld with the seven gates. We see that in Mary Magdalene's gospel with the seven powers. We see that in the seven deadly sins. Like this is a very consistent theme. And so Venus is going to go retrograde and it's going to be a pretty big deal, I think. But I just can never remember the details because
That's not your
as
thing.
much
Yeah,
as much as I would love to know everything about everything,
I know.
I'm a few years away from knowing everything about everything.
I know, I know. We have our strengths and then we lean on people who that is their thing and it's
Right.
great collaborations.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for spending some time and talking about
Yeah.
this. And I guess remind people like of your handle and how to reach you if they
Mhm.
want to contact with you.
Yeah, so I am the Mystic in the Woods on Instagram and YouTube. There is the podcast, which is the Reclamation Hour podcast. The website's under construction, but that's just the mysticinthewoods.com. So, that'll send you where you need to go and you can find all the offerings there and stuff like that if, you want to really take a deep dive into some of these things.
In April,
Hmm?
you're doing a class in April.
Yeah, so the reclamation starts in April, and that is my 3 month shadow work program with the Sacred Feminine, where we really follow this Venus cycle blueprint, for lack of a better. We go through the archetypal descent into the underworld and ascend back up. And we use the seven deadly sins as our gates because they provide us a really good structure for deconditioning all of these things. But we're really working with the Gnostic goddesses and that whole pantheon to decondition things like the Garden of Eden to understand that as an initiatory story and to go on our own initiation. So it's a really powerful group program. That one starts in April. Yeah.
Very good. Well, cool. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah.
Thanks again.
Yeah.
Thank you.